Good afternoon and welcome back to Have We Got Planning News for You? Can I start with the usual reminder that in lieu of a registration fee, we encourage you please to consider to make a donation to charity. The charities report include Brian May's Save Me Trust, particularly topical this week on nature conservation recovery, Shelter, supporting combating the housing crisis, and one of the Ukraine charities such as the Prospero World Ukraine Humanitarian Fund. We're delighted to be joined this evening by Professor Steve Ormerod, who, as well as being my colleague on the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, is the Deputy Chair of Natural Resources Wales, the Vice President of RSPB, and many other things included, as well as Britain's greatest freshwater, applied freshwater ecologist, and somebody who therefore is very well placed to tell us about phosphates, that tricky, thorny issue affecting the planning world. So we're hugely looking forward, Steve, to our discussion with you later on the nature recovery statement published last week by the nature conservation agencies, of which you co-lead the Welsh one, as well as phosphates, etc. So can you tell us, Steve, once you've unmuted yourself, where you're calling us from, what you've chosen as our theme this evening, and what if anything you're drinking?
Thank you, Charlie. Well, I'm in my office back bedroom in my house in North Cardiff, looking out over the gathering gloom here now. The specialist subject, or the theme for the evening, reflects my own work around rivers. We thought the theme of water would be more generic. So in fact, at this point, before the sun is over the yard arm, I am only drinking water, Charlie. But that's the direction of travel, I think.
Fantastic, Steve. Well, as I say, Sasha's going to lead our conversation with you later on, and we're hugely looking forward to that. Now, Mary, I can see some green behind you.
Yes, good evening, or good afternoon, good evening to you, Charlie. I'm sitting in Town Legal in the offices in London. And Steve, it's lovely to have you on the programme. And I'm drinking Thames water in your honour.
Very abstemious of you, Mary. We think it's gin, really, of course.
At this early stage of the evening.
We'll believe you. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Charlie. And I'm somewhat jealous that the sun is not yet down over the yard arm in Cardiff, because it's well and truly down in Lancashire, I can tell you. It's black outside. And I should say, in honour of you being on the show, Steve, I was going to drink some of this. I don't know if you can see it. It's a type of stout called Lancaster Black, which is very pleasant. Except my son was looking after the house last weekend, and every single means of removing the top of a bottle of beer has vanished from the house. So they'll be in the garden scattered around with the mess that was there, no doubt. So in honour of that, I'm probably going to drink some of this, which is repulsively a Yorkshire vegan drink.
Oh,
yum.
It sounds like it would taste like all the beers you sample on this show are, Paul, mainly.
It's called Sorcery, and it's from Huddersfield, and I may not make it to my case description.
Sasha, how are you?
I'm very well. Well, Charlie, you don't even need to ask that question. I wake up, England 140 for naught, and they score 506 runs in the day. I mean, what an incredible day of cricket, and I want to salute the England cricket team. I did wake up my boys at 6:40 in my excitement, much to their fury, to tell them the cricket score against my wife's good references. But there we go. No, I'm in London, and I'm much looking forward to talking to Steve, and I can assure the audience it is a really worthwhile discussion that we're going to have.
We're in for a cracker. Thanks, Sasha. Chris is travelling at the moment. We've got a pre-recorded segment from him a little bit later on, thanks to our producer, tech guru, IT wizard, Rob. So thanks, Rob, for that. Charlie Banner here. I'm at home in South Kensington. As some people know, I'm a big fan of art. I was thinking, well, what's my favourite water-themed artwork? Well, there's one that I keep in another room by an artist known as Tucker. But not the Tucker we all know, or you all know, but Ursula Tucker, Snap, Paul's lovely wife, who's a very accomplished artist, and it's a private place in another room. I'm afraid it's not fresh water, Steve, but it's nonetheless water. My water mysteriously turned into a Negroni. I had nothing to do with that, but let's say there we are. It's Thursday. Happy Thursday. Now, on to the serious stuff. So the first of our case reports is Paul, and you're going to tell us about the High Court judgment in the Hardcastle case.
Well, I confess I've just had a taste of the Witchery vegan brew, and so I may not make it to the end of this case report. I fear it's particularly foul. So my case is a case called Hardcastle against Buckinghamshire, and the interested party was BDW, which is the group for Barrett's. This is a decision of Sir Ross Cranston, formerly Mr. Justice Cranston, in the planning court, handed down 16th of November. As you can see, Richard Honey, KC, for the claimant, who was a local resident, Alexander Booth for the defendant, who was the local authority, Buckinghamshire County Council, with Hashim Mohammed coming in on the outside for the interested party. It was a decision of a grant of permission by Bucks County Council in March of 2022, but it was an application which had been submitted back in 2015, extraordinarily long period, which inevitably, therefore, led to a concern about the way in which it had been processed. It was an application or consent, ultimately, for outline permission for grant of consent for up to 170 dwellings in a small settlement called Maids Morton. The effect of the development would increase the size of the settlement by 50% in terms of numbers of houses. And it was granted subsequent to the adoption of the Vale of Aylesbury local plan in 2021. There were 6 grounds of challenge, which I certainly couldn't do justice to in the next 2 or 3 minutes. And I'm going to pick one and identify what I think is a relevant point and just flag a couple. But if I tell you, obviously, the application was made in 2015, which meant that the environmental impact assessment screening opinion, that it wasn't EIA development, also took place in 2015. There had been a resolution to grant by the committee back in 2019. It had been remitted back to the committee in 2020 as the local plan, emerging local plan, had progressed down its process under the what are called the KIDES principles. It's spelled KIDES, and everybody pronounces it different. KIDES, but I'll stick with KIDES.
KIDES.
KIDES. I'll stick with that. I'll go with that in future. Thank you. So under the KIDES principles, it was remitted back. That there had been a material change of circumstances, namely the weight to be afforded to policy. And members have said, yep, great, we still think permission should be granted, and we're going to delegate authority to our head of planning to issue the permission. So that took place in November 2020. There was further information, like a revised biodiversity net gain assessment in 2022, and ultimately permission was granted by the officer in March of 2022 after that. The grounds of challenge essentially revolved around the failure to remit the matter back by the officer on the basis there had been a material change of circumstances, such as reassessment of agricultural land quality, the changed biodiversity net gain figures between the resolution of members in 2020 and the decision of officers in 2022. And there was a straight down the line judgment that effectively the officer had legitimately concluded that the factors which had arisen didn't comprise material consideration sufficient to justify remitting it back to members. So a straight down the line consideration of the KIDES principle, which is at paragraph 100 of the judgment. But at paragraph 100, Sir Ross Cranston, with his customary verve, tells us you've got to apply common sense to these sort of things. And really, it's a matter of broad discretion to the officer. That follows a case called West Oxfordshire against Dry. But that's a useful one to have in your back pocket at paragraph 100 in relation to that. There were other grounds, but the one that I think is of most interest is the fact that the screening opinion was challenged on 2 bases. The first of which was the screening opinion itself. It was said to be wrong for various points, because it had assessed the scheme as it was in 2015 and it had changed over time. The judge said absolutely not. There's a case called Lionbrook, which is a decision of Mr. Justice Lindblom, which I lost several years ago, which says if there's been a screening opinion of substantially the same development, it doesn't matter because in the Lionbrook, it was actually a previous application. You've got to look at the substance and the sense of this. So that failed. But there was also a suggestion there should be a review of the screening opinion because of a change of circumstances, such as cumulative impacts. Well, again, in reliance on another case that I lost, this is not a great week for me. I don't know if this case was chosen deliberately, but my mate Sasha would never do that to me, I'm sure. But on the back of a case called Rydale, Crown on the application of Melton against Rydale, where Mr. Justice Dove said, I don't care what the regs say, there is an ongoing duty to reconsider a screening opinion before the determination of a planning application if there has been material change of circumstances. And that was endorsed most recently in a case called Swire, and now endorsed again in this case. And that's a bit of a warning, and I draw attention to paragraph 154 of the judgment, because if there is a screening opinion and it's negative, then it's worth a double check just before a permission is granted that nothing has changed which might have altered it so that it might now be EIA development. In this case, Richard Honey's argument that there should have been such a refreshment to the screening opinion didn't succeed, but in other cases it might. In the Rydale case, it succeeded. So two warnings there, two paragraphs and two quite useful bits for as a takeaway for the case. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Paul. And from EIA to habitats, and very good of the planning inspector to hand down a decision about phosphates. In the week we have Steve with us to talk about, amongst the things, impact on water from development and farming and inadequate infrastructure, etc. So, Mary, you're going to tell us about the Jurston Farm Wellington decision.
Yes, I am. This is the test case some have been waiting for on the question of whether an appropriate assessment is necessary before a planning authority can discharge drainage conditions on a reserved matter application following Natural England's advice, in this instance, to issue to the Somerset councils in August 2020. So this is a case where details to discharge conditions had been submitted and there was no issue between the parties about those details. The issue was simply, do you need an appropriate assessment? And if you do, what should be the scope of it? And in short, the answer was yes, or the answer is yes, you do need an appropriate assessment because under the regulations, the decision maker needs to ascertain that the permission will not have an adverse effect on the integrity of, in this case, the Somerset Levels Ramsar site. So just to break the decision down, and I must say I salute the inspector, it's an excellent decision letter. He started with paragraph 181 of the MPPF, which our keen readers will know affords certain categories of sites the same protection as habitat sites, in particular, potential SPAs, possible SACs, special areas of conservation. Sorry, I'm going into the jargon too quickly this evening. Listed or proposed Ramsar sites, or sites identified or required as compensatory measures for adverse effects on habitat sites. These are all categorised and treated as if they were habitat sites as per 181 of the MPPF, which the inspector thought was really significant in the context of this case. The appeal site lay within the Somerset Levels and Moors SPA site, and in particular, the proposed development was residential, and obviously it was going to add phosphates into the site, which was regarded as in an unfavourable condition. And again, there was no issue between the parties on the facts. Now, the guidance note that Natural England had issued said before determining a planning application that may give rise to additional phosphates within the catchment. So the argument was the determination of a reserved matters application caught by the words before determining a planning application? The appellants said it wasn't. But the inspector found that there was nothing to suggest that those words should be tied to the legal trigger points in the planning acts or the secondary legislation under them. And he said it was a reasonable interpretation that those words would indeed catch the discharge of conditions. He said that the discharge of conditions is an authorising act, which is part of a wider consent process. That seems to make sense to me, and I'm sure to most of the readers. And he disagreed with the suggestion made by the appellants that there was a threat to the outline or the reserved matters approval on the council's interpretation. And he said, whilst the habitat regulations don't require specifically an appropriate assessment at the discharge of conditions stage, the language used in Regulation 63 is broad. It refers to consent, permission, or other authorization. And so he was clear, applying the precautionary principle consistent with the Dutch nitrogen case, that this is an occasion where an appropriate assessment was required. And that really was it in a nutshell. There was another argument about the effect of the EU Withdrawal Act, but I'm afraid he didn't find favour with the appellant on that one. So there we are. We have it. You need an appropriate assessment in these situations. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Mary. We're interested to see how that case progresses. Now, next one up is I'm going to report a appeal in Fareham Borough, a decision of Inspector Mike Worden dismissing an appeal by Miller Homes and Bargate Homes for an outline application for up to 375 dwellings on a site that was within a designated strategic gap between Fareham and Stubbington. And it was the latest in a succession of proposed developments in that strategic gap, some of which already had consent, including one for 99 dwellings that had been granted on appeal in 2021. And the inspector considered that the main issues related to the impact on landscape and character, and also the compatibility of the scheme with the council's strategy for location of new housing, in particular a policy called DSP 40 of the Fareham Local Plan, which was the sort of safety catch mechanism that was engaged under the development plan where a 5-year supply of housing couldn't be demonstrated, and sought to give effect to essentially the tilted balance in circumstances where there was a housing supply shortfall, and had certain considerations that were effectively the development plan's way of looking at whether in the context of a shortfall additional sites could be released. And although there were two separate issues, landscape and compatibility with this policy, in essence, what did for this development, the inspector's findings on a particular issue, namely the impact of the development on the character and appearance of the land within the gap, having regard in particular to the cumulative effects of the fairly significant already consented development. And I'm paraphrasing, but effectively what the inspector's finding was that in combination, the developments together would wipe out the character of at least that part of the gap and cause very significant harm, and therefore conflicts with the policy DSP 40, which was subject to certain criteria intended to be enabling of development. He then went on to consider whether that policy was consistent with the framework in the context under the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework. The lack of a 5-year housing plan supply meant that the most important policies were deemed out of date, and the tilted balance was engaged, so that permission should be granted if the adverse impacts, unless the adverse impacts significantly demonstrably outweighed the benefits. And the inspector noted that in the most recent 2021 appeal, one called Brooker's Lane, the inspector in that case felt that that criteria-based policy may be unduly restrictive compared to the framework, which is in more holistic terms, adverse impacts significantly demonstrably outweigh the benefits. He felt in the particular circumstances of this case, where particularly having regard to the cumulative effects, the impact on the strategic gap was so significant that there wasn't any material inconsistency. And so he gave that policy significant weight, the conflict with it significant weight. And overall, his finding was that the applying the tilted balance under the framework, not only was the non-accordance with the development plan, but the adverse impacts of granting permission would significantly demonstrably outweigh the benefits. What are the lessons learned from that case? I mean, obviously, the findings of impact are necessarily going to be case specific, but it seems to me that there's a degree of contrast between the inspector's findings in this case and some of there was at least two decisions, one of which mine, the Clappers Lane decision earlier this year, where appeals concerning alleged coalescence were rejected. And it seems to me the differentiating factor with this one is that it was a designated gap. So it wasn't simply a coalescence argument freestanding per se, but in the context of a designated strategic gap. And therefore the relevant landscape was recognised by the development plan as contributing to separation, openness, etc., as opposed to it being a sort of freewheeling objection. And it seems to me that that probably is the the key lesson to learn from this case is that whilst coalescence arguments in the context of a housing supply shortfall here, 3.88 years, may struggle to prevail where there's no designated gap, where there is a development plan conflict, then they may well have legs. And I'm pleased to say that nonetheless, the inspector did find that there would have been no impact on freshwater ecology. And so Steve would have been happy even if the inspector had gone the other way. Now we go over to Chris, who's doing something far too grand than to be with us. I'm not quite sure where in the world he is. He said he's in transit at the time. So over to you, Chris, for your pre-recorded segment.
For this case, we go to East Suffolk, a beautiful part of the country. And this is a proposal for an appeal at Yarmouth Road, Melton, Woodbridge, obviously in East Sussex. It was a proposal for a care village, so an 80-bedroom care home, 72 assisted care bungalows, and then some recreational features, cafe, clubhouse, bowling green. And it looks like an extra care proposal to an extent, the assisted living bungalows, because there was a requirement for 4 hours care for the people who were living there. As we can see, the appeal was dismissed. There were 8 reasons for refusal, but quite a few of those related to the Section 106 agreement on affordable housing and protective habitats and so on. So those didn't feature part of the council's reasons once they got to the inquiry. They'd all been settled. There were 4 main issues: whether it was a suitable location for this development, the need for specialist accommodation, the effect on the character and appearance of the area, and would it provide suitable accommodation by way of 1 and 2 bedroom units against the council's requirements. Now, as far as the suitable location was concerned, the inspector noted all the concerns about the pavements and the ability to get mobility scooters into the settlement along pavements which are inadequate. But he took the view that it was perfectly acceptable and that there were improvements that the appellant was making, and some of the pinch points that it referred to wouldn't really cause too much of a practical problem. As for the need for specialist accommodation, there was a dispute about this between the parties. It became clear that the council were relying on one set of evidence and the appellant another. But it didn't really cause a problem because all parties accepted there was unmet need. And of course, as we know, the PPG is very supportive about the critical need for more accommodation for elderly people. So that wasn't an issue either, and nor was the suitability of the accommodation, because the appellant sensibly sought to amend their scheme to reflect the council's SPD in respect of this and were prepared to provide affordable housing. So it all came down to the effect of the character and appearance of the area. And here we see the inspector looking carefully at the landscape and visual impact assessment and thinking carefully about what was required by way of the character assessment. What he noted in particular was the not just the areas where it was located, but the fact that the character of the area was defined as being particularly rural with good field structure. And he placed particular emphasis on that and the need for intact hedgerows. If we have a look at paragraph 30, we can see the essence of what the inspector thought was the problem. And he said, nevertheless, the nearby groups of buildings are sporadic and small scale, and I find that they are characteristic of small pockets of development within the countryside, distinct from the main settlements and the wider urban form, and the appeal site and its immediate surroundings are separated from the built form of Melton, which is the nearest settlement, and Ufford. Overall, despite the existing buildings, the area reads as countryside rather than a traditional urban fringe location. So making quite clear that this was not an urban fringe location, as has been the case with some other care proposals. And although there was a golf course and it was managed, it nevertheless seemed appropriate to fit into its countryside location. So that wasn't something that the inspector felt the appellants could rely upon to say there should be developments in this area. If we turn to paragraph 34, we can see that the proposal was noted in particular, the inspector noted in particular, the removal of the frontage hedgerow. Now, remember, hedgerows are an important part of the character of the area, and he noted that approximately 139 metres of this hedgerow would be removed Of course, it would be rebuilt and replanted for the visibility displays, but that is a very significant amount of hedgerow to removed from the character of the area. And that was undoubtedly a very negative factor in the inspector's view. And finally, he says, I find that, paragraph 36, I find that despite the reduction in the overall height of the care home and the generally low level of the bungalows, the development would introduce a built form that is not characteristic of the existing area, which in the immediate area is one of small groups of development. And I think just the scale of the development, what was proposed, was considered excessive and certainly not in character with the area. So he refused it purely on the character and appearance harm arising from the landscape harm. If we just have a look at the team that was involved, we can see that the local authority were represented by Wayne Beglin of Cornerstone Barristers, and we can see that the authority fielded all its own witnesses. This is 100% in-house team from the local authority, so well done to Ben Woolnoth and his team, and in particular Nicholas Newton, who was the landscape officer.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now over to Sasha to kick off our interview with Steve. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and it's delightful to welcome Steve to the programme. I think Charlie gave you, well, actually, I don't think I can give you, frankly, build your CV up more than it frankly reflects, but just Charlie dealt with a few of the baubles that you've collected in an incredibly eminent career. But you are, obviously, your day job is Professor of Ecology at Cardiff University. Mary has slightly different memories of Cardiff University than you've had over your 40 years of eminent academic career. You're co-director of the Water Research Institute of the Cardiff School of Biosciences, vice president of the RSPB, and I think you were previously chair. Previously also chair Bug Life. Mary and I did a case once which had a seminal objection from Bug Life. We also deputy chair Natural Resources Wales, member of the UK Joint Nature Conservation Committee, where you're paid danger money to put up with Charlie as well. Previously chair of Welsh Water, and amazingly, you've written over 280 scientific papers on river and wetland ecology. And as Charlie said, and I think most of us would go in and quite happily take the brief to argue you're probably Britain's greatest expert on freshwater environment. So Steve, welcome to We Got Planning News to you. I suppose the first question I want to ask you, apart from appearing with us, what do you do? What does your day job essentially require of you?
Can I start off, Sasha, just by managing everybody's expectation down a little bit? And in fact, also that the Welsh Water job wasn't as chair of Welsh Water. I was chair of their independent environment advisory panel. But my day job, in lots of respects, I am quite an old-fashioned academic in that I spread my work over the three kind of key areas that universities work in. Some teaching, research-led teaching to final years and postgraduate taught students, largely around freshwater issues, conservation, sustainability, global change. And that's where my research has taken me over the last 40 years. So I've worked dominantly looking at the effects of things like climate change, pollution, land use change on river environments, but in particular, river organisms. Rivers have got this fantastic but overlooked aspect of biological diversity. And I've worked with everything from algae through insects to fishes to amphibians right up to birds. And since Charlie showed a work of art, I will also show a piece of river which has on it a dipper, which is one of the birds that I've worked most on. And we've shown, for example, how they are indicators of environmental quality. They tell us about a whole range of things. Most recently, we've looked at how they indicate the transit of microplastics in the environment. My third bit, the third bit of the role, the third mission, is, as you pointed out, I'm deputy chairman of Natural Resources Wales, which is our equivalent in Wales of a combination of Environment Agency, Natural England, Forestry Commission, and we, NRW has a whole range of roles: advisor, designator, statutory consultee, first responder to incidents, and I'm supposed to spend 4 days a month on that particular role. It quite often is more than that.
Okay, so quite varied. Now, can I start off by asking you about the macro issues facing ecology? Let's do an audit, if possible, with your informed position in 2022. Where do you say we are, frankly, in terms of the protection of the natural environment now today?
So I think there are different takes on this depending on whether you look at the global or the more local UK level. You know, globally, we are sailing into what Sir John Beddington, the previous chief scientist of the British government, said was a perfect storm, where all kinds of things are coalescing: demands on food supply, biodiversity loss, water resource issues. We've just very recently passed 8 billion people on Earth. We're heading probably towards 10 billion or more. We're adding 80 million people a year to the global population, which in its own right needn't be a problem, but the degree of resource demand that we place on the global environment actually are driving so many of the other pressures that we now have to contend with. So we've got indicators, for example, of global biodiversity decline, which suggests that organisms we've been monitoring for the last 40 years, and it's thousands of organisms, their populations are declining by something like 60 to 80% over that time period. If you look at the biomass of mammals across the world, something like 96% is people and their livestock, and only about 4% of the world's mammal biomass is now wild organisms. Now that I think that's dramatic. It tells us that we have dramatically, radically altered the planet, essentially to support and deliver human needs. And on the back of that, of course, we know we're struggling with serious climate change issues. We're doing our best to keep temperature gain under 1.5 degrees centigrade. Looks like we're not going to get anywhere near that. And the next 50 years are going to see very, very difficult living circumstances, for the generations who come behind us. At a UK level, we've also got, very dramatic statistics indicating that we've got about 1 in 6 of our species at risk of extinction, priority species declining at about 60%. Most of our protected areas, or many of our protected areas, are not in appropriate condition. So, taking all of that in the round, as an ecologist, who's someone who cares about the Earth's future and what it means for people, we're in serious circumstances.
I know it's pretty sobering, but necessary to face. And talking on a slightly more micro level, what about fresh water, and particularly fresh water in the UK context? What are the greatest threats being faced by the kind of environments that you look at on a weekly, daily basis?
Yeah, well, I mean, freshwaters again are interesting. The evidence we have around the world is that freshwaters are hemorrhaging biodiversity faster than any other ecosystem. They are interesting in as much as they tend to be the sinks and therefore the integrators of all kinds of things that are going on in their broader catchment. So we've already touched on things like diffuse pollution, nitrates and phosphates. We know that there are point source issues around combined sewer overflows, some issues with wastewater treatment works that don't always perform to their appropriate speculation. And I guess one of the other key dimensions of freshwaters is that a lot of the pressures that are on them interact with this growing threat we've got from climate change. So freshwaters are interesting in that they warm up in a similar way to the way the atmosphere warms up, but also as water gets warmer, it holds less oxygen. That is a stress on organisms which live in fresh water because, of course, they need oxygen from water. Most of them are also not able to regulate their own body temperatures, so they're dependent on the temperature of the medium in which they live, which means their metabolic rates are going up. They need more oxygen as water warms up. So they're in all kinds of jeopardies. And, again, we're contending with this multi-stressor set of circumstances. Now, it's not all bad news. I think we can find really interesting examples where regulatory activity in the past, things like the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, over something like a 30 or 40 year period, has certainly recovered urban river systems. So when I first came to Cardiff in 1980, 70% of the South Wales coalfield rivers grossly polluted, largely by sewage and colliery waste. We now have Atlantic salmon running in those rivers, although in small numbers. We have otters back in South Wales. We have clean water insects. We have birds like the dipper. So the lesson is, when we take action, we can turn things around and actually improve circumstances.
Okay, now let's talk about what is being done to obviously address the concerns and the consequences that you've identified. And obviously, can I ask you about the joint statement, because obviously that was released with some degree of fanfare last week. Just tell the audience what was the intention of those 7 bodies in releasing that statement?
So this is a runner essentially to COP15, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is about to meet in Montreal literally imminently. And what the statement, in fact, I did have a copy in my hand, I've just dropped it on the floor. What the statement actually points out, this is, the first time that the major statutory nature conservation bodies across the UK have come together. JNCC with Natural Resources Wales, Natural England, Nature Scot, the Council for Nature Conservation and the Countryside in Northern Ireland have come together to share a view on our need to deliver on the ambition to arrest biodiversity decline, and where we can do that in conjunction also with fixing climate change problems. So high nature, low carbon. And the key messages are that it's not too late to take action, but we cannot risk waiting any longer. We really do have to act now. Things are urgent, and we've got to take notice of the circumstances we're in. So, as you've alluded to, we had the launch of this statement at the Royal Society last week. Brian May, among others, were with us on that very, very well attended but auspicious occasion, where I think we've expressed, certainly on behalf of the statutory nature and conservation bodies, our intent that something has got to happen.
And then, therefore, looking at the context of the joint statement and the future, have you got a degree of optimism about the future or not, or are you overwhelmed by pessimism, frankly?
Well, I think anyone who is an ecologist and nature conservationist walks a very narrow line between absolute desperation at the reality of the circumstances we face, but at the same time, we all recognise and know that we've got to engender hope. If we don't hope, we will not take appropriate action. And I think we can see ways forward, given the need to act now, that go from everything from the very local. And as an example, Natural Resources Wales today released 200 captive bred water voles on a national nature reserve on Gower, Oxwich National Nature Reserve, because a lot of the pressures that used to be on water voles have been removed. So we can take those local actions, regulatory instruments, large combustion plant directive, Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive as examples have given us some kind of change and improvement. But also, I think we've got to go right through to the systemic problems that drive climate change and biodiversity decline. How do we use resources? How do we use food? How do we use transport? How do we use energy? And quite frankly, I think we've got to be better at moderating our resource use, whilst also being prepared to share our resources across the world. Social justice, intergenerational equity, I think are really major challenges, but imperatives for us.
But don't you think, from your kind of interrelationship with the students and your connection to your students, don't you notice a significant shift in their viewpoint, frankly?
But this is it's a really interesting interaction with students, because they are more sensitized to the problems than I think a lot of people have been, because they've heard those messages so much. They are alarmed. I quite often apologize to my students for the legacy that my generation, the post-Second World War baby boomers, has left them with. But I think there is another cause for optimism in the extent to which we are now taking notice of a whole range of issues, from the freshwater environment, right the way through to the general crises we face. But I think at the same time, we are trapped in a kind of lifestyle that really makes it very difficult for us to make the scale of change that we need to.
Now, what can I just ask a lot of our viewers, and obviously all of us on a daily basis, Mary's alluded to it in her appeal decision, but frankly, they're very topical issue of phosphates and nitrates and the planning system. What's your view about the approach that the planning system should take to those issues?
I mean, very clearly, we are in, again, quite challenging circumstances around diffuse pollution. I think we're trying to get to grips with what the combined sources look like in catchments which are failing. So in Wales, our special areas of conservation, in particular, fail against what are quite stringent targets. Dominantly the Usk, the Wye, the Cleddau. We have our own First Minister who's taken an interest in this particular issue. He's convened a summit of all the interested parties. That summit first met in July at our Royal Welsh Agricultural Show. It will meet again in December, and it's looking for actions from all the key players. Now, this is an issue which is in multiple. New planning developments appear to be a small part of the likely phosphorus loading in affected catchments, whereas, agriculture quite often is 60, 70%. Water resource, wastewater discharges quite often 20 or 30% plus. I mean, it seems to me that this is an issue that we should have recognised through the planning system earlier than we did. We've realised that there are cumulative impacts from that whole range of sources that I think we should have recognised and acted sooner. Now, we are in a position where action is being taken as we go forward. Nutrient management boards in place, investigations being carried out as to what the sources look like, where biological damage is greatest. And I think all of that will help us to take appropriate action, whatever it is, phosphate stripping, nature-based solutions. But again, these are river environments, precious river environments, which are being damaged by the sheer flux of nutrients that again add to other problems.
Now, can I take you into the realms of either fantasy or nightmare and ask you, if you woke up tomorrow as First Minister for Wales or as the Prime Minister in England, what would be the one thing that you'd seek to change as a matter of urgency if you had that political power for a day? It's
a really interesting question, because I wonder whether power or influence is the best tool to be able to wield in these circumstances. And as an academic, I think having influence, providing evidence, is really quite a privileged position. Were I to be someone responsible for environmental management, I would have to say I would almost certainly be very unpopular, because I would be looking for quite radical changes in the way that we lived our lives and use resources. But I'd be prioritising action to tackle the nature, the climate, the pollution crises, the big strategic tools that we've got at our disposal. We've got to change behaviour. We've got to mitigate where change, adapt to change that's inevitable, but also wherever we can, we've got to take mitigative actions that actually reduce pressures on the air environment. So those would be my priorities. I would need a very long time to do the job, I'm sure.
All right, finally, let me just ask you again, my final question is, benefit of hindsight. You've been in your field now for close to 45 years, broadly, since you first started as a fresh-faced undergraduate. Not that you're not still fresh-faced, but with the benefit of hindsight, what would you have done when you started in this field? with knowing what you do now? What would you have changed when you first started?
Yeah, well, careers are a really interesting thing, aren't they? Because as you stand at one end of the telescope looking forward, you can't actually see with the steps that you need to take that you can see with hindsight. But it seems to me that we've been too slow to act on climate change. You know, my first scientific paper on climate change was written in 1991, and we were already predicting what the effects of things like drought would be. I think we've been too slow to recognise the pressures that come out of agricultural intensification in particular. We all need to eat. We need a farming system that produces food, but we need production to come in a sustainable way. And I think we could have moderated that from an earlier stage. And in the round, you know, given that our resource exploitation is one of the systemic things that drives climate change, pollution, biodiversity, we should have recognised more early that we were in, you know, problems were developing. These are things that we've known for years to decades have been coming our way.
Mary, do you have a question for Steve?
Indeed, I do. Steve, fascinating talking to you. I'm trying to be optimistic and not too pessimistic, but what single thing do you think that government could do to assist biodiversity and climate change in the planning system?
Yeah, we've been going through something in Wales called the Biodiversity Deep Dive, to which there has been a set of recommendations which are driving us towards the aspiration of having 30% of land and sea protected condition by 2030. Now that's quite interesting, because a lot of the protected space, the planning designated protected space we have, such as national parks or OMBs, don't necessarily deliver for biodiversity. So I think legislative change that made that a priority for those areas, funding to make it a priority, would be really, really helpful. You know, if we're serious about restoring biodiversity, recovering nature, the areas where we can have biggest influence are the ones where there are large planning bodies in place who can actually help to take those kinds of actions. The people I talk to in government illustrate and tell me that it's really difficult to find the legislative time to take those steps. So we're having to look at what we call either exemplars for using the planning system in other ways to, manage river catchments in ways where we benefit the terrestrial environment, we reduce intensification, we protect fresh waters. That protection goes right the way down to marine environment. So some new instrument, as well as improved support, I think, for what our protected designated landscapes can deliver.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sasha.
Thanks, Mary. The King of the North.
Well, given that there's a fresh claimant sitting in Cardiff, then I don't think I can claim that title at the moment, Sash. Steve, I've been positively inspired by biodiversity net gain and how that's is now effectively mainstream within the planning system, notwithstanding that the Environment Act provisions haven't yet been brought into force because DEFRA is still working through the secondary legislation. And I viewed it as being very positive that as a factor of development, it's almost one is out competing developers by saying we're doing X, Y, Z, and huge percentages being raised. Do you think that is part of the solution, i.e. that developments are being required to do that? And does that help to allow agriculture to essentially trade in improving biodiversity rather than simply farming in the traditional way, which does give rise to the sort of issues that you're talking about?
Let me throw a question back at you, Paul, on that. Does agriculture have a responsibility for biodiversity net gain, or is it just linked to development?
Well, in terms of the way it works so when I deal with it, it tends to be on the back of a planning application. So I'm partway through an inquiry where part of the proposal is it's a loss of greenfield development, but the result of the improvements that we're bringing forward on part of the site means that it's going to result in, I think it's a 17.5% biodiversity net gain based upon units, and 19% in relation to linear biodiversity net gain in terms of hedges. So it means that every application that comes forward before a decision maker will have to wash its face and improve at least beyond 10% once the provisions come into force. But essentially that's happening now anyway, bizarrely. So do I think farmers have a responsibility? Yeah, they do, because they're part of society.
Well, yeah, but whether through the planning system, I don't know. I didn't know the answer to that question. I mean, but agriculture, particularly environmental land management schemes, what we call the sustainable farming scheme in Wales, is about recovering and restoring biodiversity. We're in a slightly different place in Wales in that the Environment Act, of course, 2021 applies to England. Our own environmental legislation in Wales goes back to 2016, and that explicitly talks about organisations having a responsibility to maintain and enhance biodiversity. We won't necessarily complete our assessments of biodiversity net gain until next year, and that's kind of in development. I think the answer to the question about whether it delivers depends a little bit on the scale, the intensity of what we're able to do through biodiversity net gain. So, very clearly, at a minimum, things like nest boxes and small scale provision is a good thing to have, and I'd rather have it than not. But when it comes right the way up through the hierarchy, through avoiding damage, mitigating damage, compensating for losses, a lot depends on where we can deliver, what kind of environments we can deliver. We're good at wetlands. We're not very good at ancient woodlands, for example. So there are different challenges. I think I want to see more evidence that there are areas we can turn to nature through biodiversity net gain that aren't already in some kind of designated protection, because a lot of our best nature conservation areas really are already in some form of protection. A lot of them aren't doing very well. And I asked the question a little bit around what the evidence is for biodiversity net gain being able to deliver at scale. But like you, I think, there are good reasons to be positive, at least with the intentions.
Steve, I've got a question of my own, then some audience comments. So my own question is there a country or region, part of the world that is particularly good at integrating land use policy and ecological protection that we can learn from? And the sort of rider, if you like, on that is a lot of people are commenting in the comments and Q&A about the agriculture industry, and there are various sort of ways of expressing it. But it could be said that has been said by some that to some degree on phosphates, for example, the development industry is picking up the agriculture industry's bar tab. And that for all the regulation of the kind that Mary described in the case, agriculture is able to get away scot-free with the real issues. And equally also on climate change, of course, the beef industry in particular, meat production industry, has a huge climate impact too. And for all the fancy light bulbs we have, such as the 15 in this fancy light installation behind me, that are all eco-friendly, expensive light bulbs, there's all the methane coming out the back end of cows being intensively farmed. And I noted, in fact, Brian May was very interested last week, Steve, at that event, the Nature Recovery event, in the fact that Julie James, our recent previous guest in Wales, doesn't, as far as I can tell, doesn't have an agriculture brief. Whereas DEFRA, obviously for as long as I've been alive, has mixed environment in farming. And Brian was querying, well, maybe Wales has got it right. Maybe there's a bit of a conflict of interest having agriculture and farming and indeed water under the same brief. So I welcome any observations you have on that too, on behalf of the various audience comments related to agriculture. Right,
you've asked me two really, really different questions. One about agriculture and the other about where we go to find the exemplars of how we can do things better. Let me start with your first question. I mean, one thing's I think pretty clear: the United Kingdom doesn't do very well. So there are indices around the world. We have this thing called the Biotic Intactness Index, which shows that all the countries of the UK are pretty near the bottom of the league. We're pretty bad. Mm. Countries like Canada come pretty near the top of the league. But actually the pressures on the Canadian environment, because it's very large and actually not very populated, or a bit less. So I think you've got to look for countries that are under similar kind of development pressure to the United Kingdom, but do better. And I think New Zealand and the Nordic countries probably qualify. Now, whether there is any one, or whether we've got to somehow learn in aggregate from all of them to find the best examples of what we can do better, that I think is where we can learn. But the United Kingdom is under pretty substantial pressure all round to exploit our environment, and the balance between exploitation and protection is a really, really difficult one. Now, I think that takes us to the second of your points around the way we do agriculture and the way we use food. The IPCC has been saying for a very long time, one of the biggest benefits we could have to climate change is to reduce our meat consumption. Farmers, however, tell us that it's very easy to make those arguments when we have a full stomach, when we're well fed. So we've got to acknowledge the fact that we need productive agriculture. We cannot avoid that. But I do think we've got to do it in a better way, a more sustainable way, with appropriate support that delivers for the environment. But our own use of food has got to be one of the global strategies we use to reduce our environmental footprint.
Steve, can I just ask you to finally, let's finish on a note of optimism. Can you tell us when you were happiest doing field work? What was the moment when your spirit soared the most, when you were wading presumably in some obscure river in North Wales or something comparative? What moment encapsulated why you do your work?
I'm in awe of organisms and the extent to which they are beautifully adapted to the environments in which we live, and it's one of the reasons I've worked all my life with this river bird, the dipper, fantastically adapted to swim, to dive, to go underwater, to find its food. And for about 20 years, I had a permit to handle these birds, to take measurements, to fit rings to them. And the people who would always go out into the field with me would say that I started off the days incredibly grumpy. And as soon as I had a dipper in my hand, my whole demeanor absolutely changed. So I think that interaction in the environment with living organisms in my career has been an absolute privilege. And I'm still happy to do it, Sasha. It's that there are still fantastic things we can find that teach us lessons about the natural world and how amazing it is. And that's one of the things that drives me to this aspiration to protect and restore what future generations might not have.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. You've been a wonderful guest. Charlie.
Thank you, Sasha. What a wonderful way to end the interview. Thank you, Steve. I echo what Sasha said, a real inspiration. Lots of food for thought for all of us. And thank you very much indeed. We're back for our last show before Christmas on the 15th of December at 5 p.m. We will see you all then. Thanks again, Steve, and good night.